Bull Deckhand. Yes, have you ever heard of such a thing? You know what a deckhand is? What is a deckhand?
Someone who works on a boat.
I know all hands on deck.
All hands on deck, somebody who works on a boat. Yeah. An able body is basically a hand, right? Another hand on the line. A deckhand. There are departments on a ship. There's the crew or the engine crew, and there's the deck crew, and then there's the galley, the people who do the cooking. So there are 3 departments typically on a ship. Bull deckhand. It was a term I was unfamiliar with. I had worked on the river for several years, and we had deckhands. We had 2 watches, but we didn't have a bull deckhand. I was completely unfamiliar with it. Having finally obtained the vaunted Z card, which I think I showed you, did I not? Passed it around. Having obtained this after long, arduous effort, I did not use it immediately. I, in fact, did not even get it immediately. I filed the paperwork in New Orleans, but that paperwork had to be sent to Washington, D.C., and the FBI had to run a check on me. This is much like a passport. In fact, it is. It's a sailor's passport. That's on the back of the card, had I been able to photocopy both sides. On the back of the card is my thumbprint. The FBI runs a character check. It was several years before the Iron Curtain came down, before the Berlin Wall was torn down, and I guess they had to determine whether or not I was a communist. But the paperwork was sent to Washington, D.C. from New Orleans, and I got a call from New Orleans informing me about 6 weeks later that my card had come in. And I said, well, send it to me. And they said, we can't do that. You have to come in and sign for it in person. I was in Cincinnati. But when you're in your 20s, there's no such thing as an inconvenience. It's just another excuse for a road trip, right? And that's exactly what I did. I hitchhiked. That Parks and I had that in common, right? I hitchhiked. The price was right. I hitchhiked from Cincinnati to New Orleans and picked up my Z card, and then decided to go visit friends along the eastern seaboard. And I had an old friend in Washington, D.C., Arlington, Virginia, to be precise. I went and dropped in on him. And then I had a buddy who was going to graduate school in Rutgers, so I went and visited him. And then I went on to New York City, where a friend of mine's mother had a place in Yonkers, and I spent several days visiting her and going to visit New York City. All in all, I was gone for several weeks. Just dropping in on people, unannounced. Didn't even call them, Julia. Didn't even call them on the phone and tell them I was coming. Not even when I was a day or 2 away. I just dropped in. My buddy, it had snowed. It was still winter in February, late February, in the north. It had snowed. It had snowed in New Jersey, where my buddy was going to school. And he was on his front porch shoveling the snow off when he heard me say, "Hey, Mike, how you doing?" He looked up. I'm in Cincinnati as far as he knows, right? It's like I just walked around the block. He was down the street, and I dropped in on him, dropping in on people. I worked another several hitches on the river. It was in late July when I got off the J.N. Phillips that I went to see my buddy in Chicago. Now, this is my older friend who got me on this wild hare to begin with. This is the guy who got me to ship in the first place. He was 10 years older. He had done a hitch in the Army and a stint with the post office before going to school. I hitchhiked up to Chicago. I guess rides were a lot easier to get in those days, because to drive your own car from Cincinnati to Chicago took 5 hours. And I remember hitchhiking up there in under 7. I think I got there in like 6.5 hours time hitchhiking. Rides were long, you know? I mean, you only changed roads a couple of times. You went 74 to 65 and 65 all the way to Chicago. I think I did it in like 2 or 3 rides, went the whole distance. Called my buddy from Stony Island and 79th, and he drove down and met me. We went to dinner. The next morning, right after his coffee, he says to me, should we take a trip down to the shipping hall and see what's going on? I couldn't believe it. I hitchhiked all the way up there to see him. Now he's trying to put me on a ship. But what the heck, I'm not going to turn down an invitation. We drove down to the very place I had first learned about the Z card from. We drove down and the agent Harold was there. And this time when I asked, do you have a ship? I ask it with a cockiness that only comes when you know you got that card in your pocket, right? He asked me a different question. He said, have you got your gear? And I said, well, no, it's not with me, but I can get it. I can have it by tomorrow. He said, too bad. He said, I could have put you on one this morning if you had your gear. My buddy, who never missed a beat, says to him, how long does he have to get the gear? And Harold thought about it a little while, and he said, well, till 5 o'clock this evening, 5 this afternoon. Richard says he'll be here. He drove me from 100th Street, South Chicago, to O'Hare Airport, which is on the northern side of town. Anybody know Chicago? O'Hare?
I've been to the airport.
To O'Hare?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the principal, I think still, the principal airport in Chicago. He drove me, I don't know how many, it was 100 blocks just from South Chicago to downtown. He drove me to O'Hare. I bought my ticket to Cincinnati and the return at the same time on the very next flight. I think there was like maybe an hour and a half turnaround time between when I would get off the plane and the next plane flying back to Chicago would leave. I landed on time. I took a taxi cab. To back to my apartment. I had the cab wait for me outside while I stuffed my gear in the duffel bag. Cab took me back to the airport. I got on the next plane with minutes to spare. My buddy was waiting for me at O'Hare Airport. He picked me up and took me down to the dock, which was called Rail to Water. It was basically a coal loading dock, but they also loaded grain pellets for cattle, willow.
Why didn't you just buy gear in Chicago?
Buy gear?
Yeah.
Oh man, it's very specialized, or at least, you know, you need, I don't know, I never even thought about doing such a thing. Gear's very personal, do you know what I mean? Huh?
You flew all the way.
That's true, and I think about it, when I think about it, it probably would have been cheaper, but I don't know. I went home and got everything that I was going to need for possibly several months.
Oh, okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh, okay.
They loaded grain, Felicia, at the same dock. Yeah, they loaded grain as same dock where they loaded coal. And there were huge puddles of stagnant water that was basically coal dust, and floating in it were rotting pellets, grain pellets. So the place stunk, as well as, yes, and you know, I mean, you had to walk through the mud to get to the ladder. I noticed the name of the ship as I was getting on. It didn't look anything like the ships I would imagine I'd be sailing on. But I climbed up the ladder with my duffel bag on my shoulder, and when I got to the top, there was a watchman standing by the ladder to make sure that people, if they fell off, would get some assistance, right? When I got to the top of the ladder, I said, W.W. Holloway. What's the W.W. stand for? He said, worka worka. And he didn't seem too excited about it. The ship was about 2 or 3 hours late, casting off. We were supposed to leave at 5, right? I had to be back by 5. I had made it back, but not by much. But I think it was about 7 or 8 o'clock that evening when we finally did cast off. The irony is that I had dreams. I thought I would get on one of these lake boats and I would run from the tip of Lake Michigan. Possibly to Duluth at the other end of Superior. That I'd go down to Detroit, and possibly to Buffalo. That I'd go through the Sioux and through the Wellman Canal. And possibly even go out the St. Lawrence Seaway and find my way to sea. It had been done. I'd seen ships with Polish flags. I knew that ships came down the St. Lawrence Seaway and docked in Chicago. Do you know where this coal boat was going? It was going to Milwaukee. Do you know how long it takes to get to Milwaukee? How?
2 hours long.
Well, it takes about an hour by car, and by ship loaded, it takes about 11 hours. Yes, unloaded 9. Do you know where we went after we unloaded in Milwaukee? Back to Chicago for another load, Malachi. And do you know where we went after that? Back to Milwaukee. Yes, this ship made something like 100 straight trips to Milwaukee. We were stuck in a coal run. I was basically working on a shuttle. Here's the irony, and that's that no one in his right mind would get on this ship, and no one, even crazy, would stay on it. Consequently, the ship was sailing short-handed. I had flown back to Cincinnati to get my gear for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, only to discover that I could have gotten on that ship the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. For the next 2 weeks, I could have gotten on at any time because we were sailing, when I first got on, not one, but two deckhands short-handed. I made number 2. There were 2 of us to do the work of 3. The crazy thing about a ship is it's a little bit like the military. There's a chain of command. And the very, very bottom of the food chain does just about 90% of the undesirable work. It starts with the captain, the order, and it passes down all the people in the chain of command, and then finally it's 2 groups of people who have to execute. One, the deckhands, they take care of everything on top, on the deck. The other was the tunnel gang. These were the guys who worked down in the guts of the ship. Ship looked like this. There were after quarters and there were forward quarters. This is the bow and this is the stern. And then there were hatches. And I'm not going to draw them all because there were like 27 of them. 27 hatches. And the hatches were funnel-shaped. They came down to a point. A coal tipple would come and shoot the coal into the hatches to load. But to unload, we were what was called a self-unloader. There didn't need to be any apparatus at the other end. There was a conveyor belt that ran along the keel of the ship, just above it, a conveyor belt. And there was an escalator of coal buckets that transported this coal up to a boom that had a conveyor belt on it, and it offloaded the coal on the shore. We could switch the boom from side to side, offload to either side. Now, the tunnel gang's job was to open the gates. And you couldn't just go along and throw them open, because if you did, too much coal would run down at one time and it would jam the belt. The other thing is, you can't just start anywhere and unload a hatch. You've got to unload a little from the back and a little from the front and a little from the middle. And it's a job of expertise. You got to know what you're doing. Comes from experience. The guys who worked down below, that was the tunnel gang, affectionately known as the tunnel rats. It was little better than working in a coal mine. The clearance was barely 6 feet, and you were breathing coal dust for 6 hours at a time, and then for another 7 or 8 on a cleanup going back to Chicago. That was their job. Job of the deckhand was to drag cable and help them shift the ship forward and back in order to determine where you're going to put the pile. The other job was there was always spillage. The tipple would sometimes miss the hatch, and you'd have a pile of coal on the deck. Kenny, our job was to come with a shovel and shovel the coal back into the hatch.
That's a bad job.
No, it's a bad job. It's a grunt job, right? The other thing that was bad is that when there were girders, steel girders that reinforced these hatches, and the coal would hang up in the girders. And our job was to kick it loose with our foot. Now, these were very severely banked, these hatches. And coal is essentially oil that just hasn't been under enough pressure long enough, right? Coal is slippery. And this stuff was more powder than lump, so it was very, very slippery. There were chains that hung off of these, off of the walls. There were chains that hung off of the walls or bulkheads of these hatches. And there were razorbacks inside here that were very, very narrow. And that's what you would finally go down into the gate on. Razorbacks, they were about 1/3 as wide as a tight wire, right? The kind that guys would walk. You'd have to walk across those to get to the other side and grab hold of the chain for dear life, while you swung from side to side to get up to the girder, because you're talking about a 60-degree slant, and then you would try to kick the coal loose. It was like an iceberg of coal in dimension. And when it would break loose, it was a small avalanche. It would come pouring down. Heaven forbid you should slip, because now you're down into the gates covered with an avalanche of coal. The deck watch's job, and he was our immediate superior, was to hold the button. He had an electric cord that would stop the conveyor belt so they could dig you out. When I got on, there was 1 deckhand and 2 missing. And the deckhand's name was Bernie. He was a long drink of water, as they say, a skinny, lanky lout, right? He was the other deckhand, and he had only been on himself for about 8 or 9 days, and he was fixing to quit. The only reason he hadn't already is because the deck watch, immediate superior, was a guy named Stevie. Stevie, Naya. Stevie was Bernie's brother-in-law. Twice over. Do you know what that means? Stevie was married to Bernie's sister. Bernie was married to Stevie's sister. This was not that uncommon in Logansport. It was a very small town where everyone knew everyone, possibly intimately. And Stevie, thanks Kelsey, Stevie had been promoting the job for a long time to Bernie, and Now he had his brother-in-law on the ship with him, which was like having part of home. But with Stevie, or rather Bernie, fixing to quit, Stevie kept telling him, relax, Bernie, you're now the Bull Deckhand. The other guy that had quit had been older. You're now the Bull Deckhand. And you're going to, you're next in line for a deck watch position. Every time we'd have a really terrible job, Stevie would give it to me. And I put up with this for about 2 days because Stevie told me Bernie doesn't have to do it. He's the Bull Deckhand. Bull Deckhand. So I asked the other 2 deck watches. You got to understand, a ship works on watches. That's what you landlubbers call a shift, right? A watch. There was a 4 to 8, I'm sorry, a 12 to 4. There was a 12 to 4. There was a 4 to 8. And there was an 8 to 12. If you were on the 12 to 4, you worked midnight till 4 in the morning, and you were off until noon when you came back and worked from noon until 4. A watch was to die for. You had 4 on, 8 off. A deckhand, by contrast, or the tunnel rats, by contrast, worked whenever there was work to do. If you got to the port in Milwaukee and you started to unload and it took 8 hours, you worked 8 hours. If there was some kind of breakdown in the machinery and it took 12 hours, you worked 12 hours. The watches, meanwhile, continue to change. I asked George, who was the 4 to 8 deck watch, and who was only like 18 years old, but uncommonly mature for his age, and strong, a capable guy on every account. I asked George, I said, George, how's this Bull Deckhand thing work? He said, Bull Deckhand? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, okay. The next time I'm on watch with Stevie and he says, do this. And I say, why? There's 3 of us here. He says, because Bernie doesn't have to, he's the Bull Deckhand. I said, Stevie, the Bull Deckhand is Bull Bleep. And I said, you can go and tell the mate if you want to. I don't care. George must have been a good advice because Stevie grumbled. He and Bernie collaborated briefly, and then both of them followed me down into that cargo hold, Stevie holding the button. I'm not sure if I would have fallen if he would have pressed the button or not, but at least I got a little help this time around. That night, when we knocked off and we were done, now we're on the run to Milwaukee, and we have time to clean up and get some sleep before we start unloading at the other end. I mean, this is a horrible job. All you do is work and sleep in filth, right? It's a coal boat. You're breathing it. You're eating it. It's everywhere. I cleaned up the best I could and got in bed, and meanwhile, Stevie and Bernie were drinking as they did every night. They were drinking in Bernie's quarters. I had a room to myself because the other bunk wasn't taken. We were short-handed. I had just about gotten to sleep. I don't think I had been asleep 20 minutes, Jeremy, when all of a sudden the door flies open and the light blazes. The light comes on the overhead, and it's Stevie. One of the jobs of the deck watch was to call the watch out, to call the deckhands when we were getting close to port. I had just gotten to sleep. Here comes Stevie. He has thrown my door open, turned on the light, and he barks in his drunkenness. He barks, "Watch time, get up!" Man, oh man, I thought, this can't be. I just got to sleep, I think. It sure felt like it. Could I be that tired? I looked at my watch and boy, oh boy, there's no way we couldn't have gotten that fast to Milwaukee if we'd been in an airplane. I didn't bother to to try to chase him down. I figured he was probably drunk and that would be the end of it. And I tried to go back to sleep and succeeded. And just about the time I was back asleep, the door flies open and the light flashes on again. It's Stevie. Watch time, get up! Oh man, this could go on all night. I put my clothes on and I started up the deck. And as I did, coming down the deck was George, who was off watch and who was going to watch a little television back in the galley. And he said, "Oh, what are you doing up at this hour, man?" He said, "You better get your sleep. We're going to have to work in about another 6-7 hours." And I said, "Stevie's been waking me up." And George said, "Oh, he's messing with you." He said, "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "Well, George, if I don't find him, I'm on my way up to the pilot house," who was navigating the boat. "I'm on my way to the pilot house to tell the mate." George said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." He said, "The mate ain't going to do nothing." I said, "Well, what should I do, George?" He said, "Well, if I were you, I'd take care of it myself." So I go back to bed, right? But I don't take my clothes off. I leave my clothes on and I get under the sheet, and I don't have to wait long before the door flies open and the light blazes, and it's Stevie. "Watch time! Get up!" He's drunker than ever. And I pretend like I have just slept through that. "Watch time," I said, "get up!" I affected a snore. I got him in as deep as I could. I got him so close, in fact, he had me by the shoulder. He was shaking me by the shoulder, and I come up out of the bunk, and I hit him. Now, I'd like to tell you that I cold-cocked him, that I pole-axed him, that I knocked him into next week. But the truth of the matter is, I barely clipped him on the chin. Stevie was backpedaling the second he saw me coming up out of that bunk. He was backpedaling, and as he fell through the door, he grabbed it by the knob, and he hung on to it on the other side for dear life. Now, he is holding on to the knob on one side, and I'm trying to pry it open on the other. And finally, when I succeed, it's because he's turned it loose. But when I look out the door, he is running down the corridor, bouncing from bulkhead to bulkhead like a pinball. The next morning, when I get up, I notice down on the deck there are these bright, real dark brown splotches on the deck. Deck was painted what they called it was red. Red lead is what we used to paint the stuff with, and the deck had that color. It was a dull, flat finish, but these were dark brown splotches, right? When I get back in the galley, George is back there telling the crew what had happened. He had apparently been in the pilot house talking to the mate when Stevie that night came up. And his face was a mess. And he apparently said to the mate, "That new deckhand jumped me." And the mate said, "Stevie, that's your problem. You're drunk besides. Get the hell out of here." And Stevie said, "I don't have to take this. I'm quitting when we get to Milwaukee." And the mate said, "Be my guest." As it turned out, apparently Stevie in his drunken stupor had fallen face forward down the ladder. Now that's what you call a staircase on a ship, because it's made of steel and it's extremely steep. And there's a sign that hangs over the stairwell that says, "Think, accidents can be avoided." Stevie had apparently pitched forward and his face had apparently bounced on every step on the way down. My reputation was made. Seriously, everybody thought that I had beaten him senseless. Not with a staircase, but with my bare hands. The word was out, don't mess with that maniac. From Southern Ohio, he'd just go crazy on you. I saw Stevie because when Stevie quit, there was no reason for Bernie not to quit. And the two of them quit together when we got to Milwaukee. Stevie's face was a swollen mess, and if Band-Aids were any indication of lacerations, he had many of them. His face was covered with Band-Aids. In fact, he could barely see out of his eyes, and when he got on the ladder, he grabbed a hold of it with his feet and his hands, and very tentatively found the rest of it with his feet, crawled down the ladder, he and Bernie. And now I not only jumped from deckhand to the first deckhand, I was now the deck watch. And I had gone from the lowliest of the low to a deck watch without ever being the Bull Deckhand. You want to see a picture of that stairwell? First off, I'd like you to see the ship itself. That's the Holloway. Crazy, because this ship was built in 1907. Had this been saltwater, there's no way this ship would have still been in existence. But because it was freshwater, it lasted longer, considerably longer. It had been converted. It was a steam vessel to begin with. It had been converted from steam to diesel in, I want to say, like 1955, 58, something like that. But 27 hatches. You can see the boom. I'm going to send it around to you. You can see the boom, which is what made this kind of ship a self-unloader. The W.W. Holloway. What's the WW stand for? Worka. You got it. Yes. Good. The staircase. The ladder. The after ladder. Look at that. You can't really see the staircase. You can only get a feel for the steepness of it. But how about that sign? Think. Accidents are avoidable. Is that a classic? Yes. Very good. Okay, guys. Thank you.